ITW Dynatech is a worldwide leader in the manufacture of both conventional and reactive adhesive application equipment. This video will cover the installation and startup procedures for the Dynamelt PUR Series bag melter equipment. Unlock the electrical cabinet using the supplied key. There are two latches. Route the AC power cable under the bag melter chassis and up through the cable entry port inside the electrical cabinet. The bag melter may be shipped configured for either 230 volt 3-phase or 400 volt 3-phase plus neutral. The example in this video will show the connection for 230 volt 3-phase. You will find gray-colored spring-loaded wire junctions for the 3 power phases and a green-yellow wire junction for ground in the lower left corner of the electrical cabinet. The neutral for 400 volt AC configurations will also be in the same location. Use an appropriate size flat-bladed screwdriver to open the wire terminal clamping jaws by gently lifting up on the screwdriver while inserting the wire leads. Reinstall the cable entry port cover when all wiring is complete and relock the electrical cabinet using the supplied key. System air is connected at the lower right side of the bag melter electrical cabinet. Only one connection supplies all required air inputs to the melt unit. It is important that the air pressure supplied to the melt unit be as close to 87 psi or 6 bar as is possible. Higher pressures may create unsafe operating conditions and should be avoided. The feed tube platen pressure is adjusted via its own air regulator. Typical air pressures will range from 20 to 30 psi but will vary based upon glue types and desired melt rates. The air regulator is adjusted when the platen is in the down position by lifting up on its knob, setting the desired pressure, and then pushing the knob down to lock it. The bag melter is powered on via a master switch located on the electrical cabinet. There are currently 2 operating systems offered, Dynatech Proprietary and Siemens. It is beyond the scope of this video to go into the details of each control interface. However, menus will be presented that allow the programming of all necessary parameters for the setup and operation of the melt system. Removing the side panels allows access to the inside of the melt unit for the attachment of hoses and the conduct of maintenance. This is easily accomplished by lifting up the panel using the handles, rotating the bottom away from the base frame, and then lowering the panel towards the floor. Remove all 3 panels in the same manner to gain full access to the inside of the melter. Assure all heating zones with the exception of the melt unit are turned off until the equipment is electrically connected. Otherwise, there will be the potential for a fault condition within the melt unit. Attach each hose to its appropriate electrical connector. Turn on the associated heating zones and allow the hose to come up to its operating temperature prior to uncoiling it if the hose already has glue in it. Attach the supply hose to the output manifold as would be done with any other melt system. It is important that you wear the appropriate personal protective equipment when the system is hot. Tighten the hose fittings using a wrench. The system in this video utilizes a recirculating applicator with a return hose. Attach this hose to the appropriate fitting on the glue reservoir as was done with the supply hose. Attach the electrical connector at the distant end of the supply hose to the input fitting of the glue applicator, then connect the supply hose fluid fitting. Use a wrench to tighten the fluid fitting. The distant end of the return hose requires no electrical connection. Dress the cable along the hose and insert a plug into the electrical connector. Attach the return hose fluid fitting to the applicator, tightening it with a wrench. We will now discuss the process of preparing the melt unit for glue. There are 4 clamping bolts that seal the feed tube and melt grid assembly to the reservoir. one at each corner of the melt grid. Loosen these bolts and rotate them to the side of the reservoir. Be certain to use protective equipment if the melt unit is hot. Swing the top of the melter to the hinge side to expose the reservoir. There is a tether that will prevent the melt grid from rotating too far. Take care to control the opening of the melt grid to avoid damage to the equipment. Remove the return hose from the reservoir for recirculating systems, or the hose at the glue applicator for non-recirculating systems, and place the hose into an empty box with a sealed bottom. Turn on the motor and proceed to pump as much glue from the reservoir as is possible. You can leave the melt grid tilted open during this process in order to gauge its progress. Remember to open the melt grid carefully in order to avoid damage to the tether. The system relieves pressure from the hoses back into the reservoir when the motor is shut off. Always close the melt grid temporarily when turning off the motor if the fluid level in the reservoir is low, to avoid splashback and possible personal injury. Here is a slow motion view of what can happen when the reservoir pressure relief opens upon pump motor shutoff. The reservoir must be thoroughly cleaned of residual material before the glue is added to the system. This is most easily accomplished by removing the 3 heat conducting plates mounted on the reservoir's auxiliary heat cylinder. Loosen the clamping bolt on each plate, then slide them off the auxiliary heater. These plates should be immediately cleaned while they are still hot. All surfaces are hot. The proper protective equipment should be worn at all times. Turn the pump on at a slow speed. Use a scraper or similar tool to move all remaining material to the pump feed hole in the bottom of the reservoir. Care should be taken to avoid damaging the special release coating that is on all wetted parts of the melt grid and reservoir. Dual pump systems will have 2 feed holes, one on each side of the reservoir. This is an important process. The neutralizer is lighter than most PURs and will float to the top of the reservoir where it will remain trapped, eventually degrading into a gummy mess that will affect system performance. This procedure is required only on initial startup and during periodic maintenance when the system is completely flushed. Remember to close the reservoir when shutting off the pump to avoid pressure relief splashback. Use lint-free towels to wipe the remaining material from the bottom of the melt grid, reservoir, and auxiliary heat cylinder. Disposable, non-woven shop towels work quite well for this purpose. The release coating on these surfaces makes this task fairly easy to accomplish. Reinstall the heat conducting plates to the auxiliary heat cylinder. Position them equidistantly on the auxiliary heat cylinder and then retighten the clamping bolts. The cylinder may then be rotated to provide a gap between the reservoir surface and the conducting plates. Note that the bottom of the melt grid is beveled to its 4 corners. This is done to assure all air is purged via the 4 holes at these corners as the glue fills the reservoir. The other holes allow molten glue to pass from the feed tube on the top side of the melt grid into the reservoir, keeping it full at all times to prevent air infiltration. Close the reservoir and hand tighten the clamping bolts at each corner of the melt grid. Again, the equipment is hot, so proper personal protective equipment should be worn. Use an appropriate sized wrench to tighten the clamping bolts an additional 1/4 turn to assure a tight seal of the reservoir gasket to the lower melt grid surface. We will now discuss the process of loading adhesive into the melt unit. The adhesive must be packaged in sealed bags to be used with the bag melter. Remove the bag from its outer packaging and turn it upside down to reveal the bottom of the bag. Use a utility knife to cut the bottom of the bag, leaving 3/4 to 1 inch of border around the outer perimeter. Many times there is a seam at the bottom. Cutting inside the seam provides a guide for this process. The border provides an airtight seal when the bag is inserted into the feed tube. Peel and dispose of the cutout from the bottom of the bag to expose the adhesive bottom. Some adhesives will not afford the easy release of the cutout from the bottom of the bag. This will require the use of a hot air gun and pliers to remove the cutout. The hot air gun should be used to soften the glue enough to pull off the cutout using pliers and appropriate personal protective equipment. Be certain to remove all loose pieces. Bits of bag may plug the melt grid feed holes, get sucked into the pump, or plug the glue filter, creating inconsistent glue flow and possible equipment damage. Fully raise the platen, pull up on the latch, and swing the platen cylinder away from the feed tube. Looking into the feed tube, you will see the supply holes that allow the molten glue to pass into the reservoir. Closer inspection reveals the patented ring at the bottom of the feed tube that provides an airtight sealing surface for the border that was left on the bottom of the bag. Take the bag of adhesive, cut out side down, and insert it into the feed tube. Many times there will be a significant pocket of nitrogen gas in the top of the bag. Remove this gas by making a single small slit slightly above the glue level and pushing out the gas. Carefully fold over the top portion of the bag to seal this slit. Raise the locking knob and rotate the platen back into position over the feed tube. Assure the air pressure to the platen is between 20 and 30 psi. Lower the platen and place the melt unit into automatic feed mode. Assure all temperatures are properly programmed into the melt unit and wait approximately 20 minutes to partially fill the reservoir. Program the pump speed to a mid-range value and turn on the pump motor. Monitor the pressure gauge to assure it is at a level consistent with glue being pumped through the system. Place the hose into a box with a sealed bottom and continue to pump the glue through the system in order to purge out all neutralizer. Eventually, the glue will begin to exit the hose. It is helpful to have a sheet of white paper on the side of the box in order to more easily determine when the fluid stream from the hose is all glue. Turn off the pump once all neutralizer has been purged from the hose. It is now time to reconnect the hose to either the return fitting on the reservoir or the glue applicator, dependent upon how your system is configured. There is currently air trapped inside the reservoir. We will release this air by occasionally opening one of the purge vent screws at the corner of the melt grid as the reservoir fills with molten glue. Retighten the vent screw once the air is released. You can completely remove one of the vent screws and insert a screwdriver or other long, slender tool into the hole as a gauge to determine the progress of filling the reservoir. No production work should be undertaken until the reservoir is completely filled with adhesive. Eventually, glue will seep from the purge plug when it is opened. When this occurs, retighten the plug and clean any molten glue from the top of the melt grid. At this point, the other three plugs should be opened slightly until glue flows from them to allow any air trapped in the corners of the reservoir to escape. The same procedure should be undertaken at least once each week during normal operations. One glue pressure relief valve is installed for each independent pump stream in your system. This valve opens immediately upon motor turn-off and stays open for 10 seconds after the motor is turned on in order to flush fresh PUR through the valve mechanism. Warning signals for both low bag and empty bag conditions are provided by monitoring devices. When the bag is empty, raise the platen and swing it away from the feed tube opening. Reach into the tube and lift out the bag, taking care not to make a mess on the tube walls. These surfaces are hot. Personal protective equipment should be worn at all times. A new bag should have been prepared in advance and immediately inserted into the feed tube, especially if production is ongoing during this process. Go through the same procedures for loading a bag as previously discussed in this video. Once again, purging air from the reservoir after a bag change is a good practice, especially if there is some concern that the bag was not replaced immediately after it was emptied. This concludes this instructional video. Thank you for your purchase of ITW Dynatech products. Please consult with the operator's manual or Dynatech technical support for additional information concerning this equipment.